Landon Pierce wasn't just a billionaire. He was a calculated hurricane wrapped in Armani silk, the kind of man whose smirk could seduce a camera lens and sink a fortune with a single shrug. His name bled across headlines like a golden brand, a tech prodigy turned playboy, with blue eyes sharp enough to slice through boardrooms and hearts alike. In Manhattan's towers of glass and steel, Landon reigned with unapologetic confidence, masking the hollow echo of his success with noise. Fast cars, faster women, and nights that blurred into silk sheets and whispered lies. But beneath his empire of algorithms and applause lay a darker addiction, the thrill of conquest. To Landon, women were chess pieces in a game he always won. His friends handed him challenges, and he devoured them without pause, leaving behind broken trust and lipstick-stained silence. That night, the gala sparkled like a snow globe of wealth, crystal chandeliers dripping like frozen stars, champagne fizzing in golden flutes, and violins singing a melody money could buy. Landon stood at the center, magnetic and untouchable, a god among men in a room that worshipped everything artificial. But then came a whisper, casual, cruel, and soaked in amusement. "See that girl?" a voice murmured behind a smirk, pointing toward a girl who looked like she'd stepped out of another century. Mercy Yoder didn't belong there. Not in that room, not in that world. She wore a plain gray dress, its fabric loose and uninviting, her posture composed yet delicate, her honey blonde hair braided tightly beneath a white bonnet like a sacred vow. Her eyes, though downcast, held a stillness more powerful than any diamonds worn that night. "Amish, virgin," the voice added, as if it were a punchline. "Bet you can't break her by sunrise." The air seemed to pause. Landon turned to get a better look, and for a moment, just a fraction, something stirred behind his carefully molded arrogance. He hadn't seen innocence in years. Untouched, untainted, unapologetically pure. His smirk returned like armor. "That's not even a challenge," and he said, lifting his glass. But as his eyes locked on Mercy, he didn't see weakness. He saw fire trapped in porcelain, a soul that didn't need the world's approval to glow. He approached not like a gentleman, but like a lion who assumed the lamb would tremble. What he didn't know was that this lamb had lived through storms without ever learning how to kneel. Mercy stood in quiet contrast to everything he was, a mirror he wasn't ready to face, a him in a room filled with noise. Landon didn't realize he wasn't the hunter tonight. He was the hunted. The bet was made, the night was young, and the clock began ticking on what he thought would be another victory. But fate, in all her poetic cruelty, had other plans. For when he stepped into her world with a smirk and a lie, he didn't know he was walking straight into the arms of the one woman who would undo him without ever raising her voice. She didn't need silk to shine. She didn't need heels to stand tall. She didn't need to flirt or fight. Her power was quiet, ancient, sacred. And Landon, for all his bravado, was about to learn that the purest souls don't break. They reveal. In Mercy's silence, he would find the weight of every woman he'd wronged. In her eyes, he would see the man he could have been. And in her refusal to fall, he would find himself on his knees. Not in conquest, but in surrender. Mercy Yoder had never seen so many lights in her life. Manhattan pulsed like a living galaxy, every building reaching for heaven, every horn blaring like it had something urgent to say. But she moved through it with the grace of someone unshaken by noise or chaos. Her world had been barns, silence, scripture and soil, not sirens and shimmering skylines. She came not to chase dreams, but to search for the missing piece of her heart, her sister Miriam, who had vanished into this glass jungle 5 years ago and had left only silence behind. Mercy's fingers trembled the first night she walked into the gala hall, clutching the edge of a borrowed apron, the dress beneath her plain and stiff, the shoes too tight, her eyes wide with wonder and nerves. But she told herself this was where she needed to be. If her sister had once walked among these glittering strangers, perhaps her shadow still lingered in a corner. Mercy was a ghost in the room, unnoticed by most, yet somehow more present than all the women in jeweled gowns laughing behind champagne flutes. While others sparkled with wealth, she shone with something untouched: dignity, warmth, sincerity. She moved through the room silently, refilling glasses and clearing half-eaten caviar, unaware that her very presence had caught the attention of someone who only noticed what he could conquer. When Landon stepped into her orbit, she didn't flinch or retreat. She simply looked up with steady curiosity, her lashes golden in the chandelier light, her expression open but not naive. "Are you one of the donors?" she asked, and there was no flirtation in her voice, just simple, respectful interest, as if she were speaking to a stranger at a church picnic. Landon, caught off guard by her composure, leaned in with the kind of smile that had disarmed heiresses and Hollywood stars. But it felt different now. It wasn't working, and he didn't understand why. "No," he said slowly, choosing his words like a man fumbling in the dark. "I'm just here for an experience." He watched her reaction, expecting the usual blush or giggle, but she simply nodded and turned to refill a glass of water. Her movements smooth, her eyes still steady, as though she'd looked right through the charm and seen something raw underneath. Mercy's world wasn't made of deals or games. It was made of intention, and though she didn't know Landon's name or his reputation, she sensed the weight he carried in his shoulders, the kind that came not from struggle, but from emptiness. She wasn't dazzled by his tailored suit or the scent of expensive cologne. She noticed instead the pause in his breath when she smiled and the way his fingers twitched like he wasn't used to being still. Landon tried again, asking where she was from, and she told him gently of the fields back in Lancaster, of early mornings baking bread, and the stars so bright they felt like prayers in the sky. He had never met anyone who spoke like the world wasn't something to own, but something to respect. As she spoke, he stopped thinking about the bet. For a moment, he stopped thinking at all. She mentioned her sister, a tremor in her voice betraying her worry, and he offered help without fully understanding why. He just wanted to make that look of sorrow vanish from her eyes. Mercy thanked him without hesitation, as though kindness was still something she believed in. She asked nothing of him. No questions about his money, no attention-seeking games, just a brief, honest smile before moving on to her next task. And as she walked away, the scent of vanilla and lavender trailing behind her, Landon stood frozen, oddly winded, staring after the girl who wasn't supposed to matter. He'd been with women who had bathed in diamonds and laced their laughs with venom, but none had ever made him feel so seen. He didn't know it yet, but something had cracked open in that moment, a quiet fracture in the armor he'd built around his heart. For the first time, he didn't feel like a man with power. He felt like a boy who didn't deserve to be in her presence. Mercy, oblivious to the war she had started inside him, continued on with her tray, her mind still fixed on the last letter her sister had written, her heart both aching and resilient. And Landon, the predator who had walked into the room expecting to break her, now found himself wondering if he even had the strength to hold her gaze again without falling apart. Landon couldn't explain why he kept finding reasons to pass by the nonprofit kitchen, why his meetings suddenly started ending early, or why his driver was instructed to slow down each time they neared the quiet corner of the city where Mercy now volunteered to help with food drives. But something inside him refused to stay still, and it wasn't lust or boredom. It was curiosity, maddening and magnetic. In a life where everything had been predictable and transactional, Mercy was the first person who didn't orbit his gravity, and that made him gravitate to hers. She didn't demand his time or bat her lashes to keep him lingering. She simply looked at him like he was just a man, not a millionaire, and that level of disarming honesty cracked something fragile in his chest. Mercy had never ridden in a limo, never tasted sushi, never heard jazz played live. But when Landon offered these experiences under the guise of kindness, she accepted not out of awe, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove, only something to discover. The first time they visited an art museum, she paused before a painting that meant nothing to him, but moved her to tears. He watched as she stood frozen before a field of oil-painted light, her hand pressed to her chest, whispering, "This looks like home." And in that moment, he envied the simplicity of her emotions, the depth of her wonder, the way she didn't filter her feelings for anyone's comfort. He started bringing her books, poetry, philosophy, journals she'd never been permitted to read back home, And the way she devoured each one, scribbling thoughts in the margins and asking him questions he didn't know how to answer, made him realize how much of the world he'd taken for granted. She taught him that silence could be eloquent, that stillness could be strength, and that kindness didn't need a spotlight. Mercy asked about his life too, but never in the greedy way others did. She wanted to know what made him laugh as a child, whether he missed his mother, if he ever watched the moon without checking the time. And he answered, not with the polished, curated version of himself he gave the media, but with fragments he'd hidden for years. It was the first time someone saw the bruises beneath his success, the exhaustion behind the blue in his eyes, and didn't try to fix him, only to understand. He found himself waiting for her texts, which were short and sincere, sometimes just a photograph of a flower or a line from a book. But they grounded him more than boardroom deals or champagne brunches ever had. He tried to ignore the tight knot forming in his chest, the way her name echoed even in his sleep. But the truth was relentless. This wasn't a game anymore. The longer he spent with her, the more the lie he'd built between them began to poison every moment. She thought he was helping because he cared, and part of him did, desperately. But another part of him knew this all started from a cruel bet, and that knowledge throbbed like guilt in every heartbeat. When she smiled, he flinched inwardly. When she thanked him, his throat tightened. When she said she trusted him, he almost confessed everything on the spot. But he didn't, and that silence grew heavier each time they were together. Mercy, for all her innocence, was no fool. She noticed how he stared at her when he thought she wasn't looking, how his laughter came slower now, more real, how his eyes looked away when emotions got too close. She had a poet's intuition, and even if she couldn't name it yet, she sensed the storm beneath his stillness. Landon, meanwhile, was unraveling in the most terrifying way possible. Not from scandal or threat or failure, but from the quiet realization that he might be falling in love with someone whose soul could never be bought, someone who didn't belong to the world he ruled. He had built walls for so long that he forgot what it felt like to be vulnerable, and now here she was, slipping past his defenses without even trying, turning his empire of ego into trembling glass. He told himself she'd leave soon, that this was temporary, that eventually the illusion would break and she'd walk back into her world. But another part of him, softer, scared, selfish, wanted to hold her in place forever, to rewrite the bet into something noble, to earn the version of himself she saw when she looked at him. But love doesn't grow in lies, and the longer he waited, the more he realized he was balancing between salvation and ruin. Mercy, meanwhile, walked beside him like a quiet promise he hadn't yet made, but desperately wanted to. The gentle rhythm of Mercy's steps had become a familiar comfort to Landon. But the day her voice cracked with hesitant hope, telling him she'd found a lead, a name scribbled on a faded registry from a Manhattan homeless shelter, something shifted between them, something weightier than all the unspoken feelings that had been building like thunderclouds between their glances. And so, without hesitation, he called in the best investigator money could buy, cloaking his nerves behind efficiency, never letting her see the dread blooming in his gut, because deep down, a quiet voice whispered, this truth would either set her free or destroy her entirely. Mercy clutched the printed document like it was a lifeline, her eyes scanning each typed name with trembling precision, her breath catching when she saw it. Miriam Yoder, registered 3 years ago, last listed address a downtown rehab clinic. They visited the shelter together, the air heavy with unspoken dread, and the staff, kind but weathered by years of tragedy, confirmed what Mercy hadn't yet let herself believe. Her sister had come in broken, fighting withdrawal, then vanished for months before her body was found in an alley behind a motel with a needle still in her arm. The world fell silent. Mercy didn't scream, didn't collapse immediately. She just stood there, her eyes wide and hollow, as though her soul had quietly slipped from her body and left behind only the weight of unbearable grief. Then she turned into Landon's arms, and everything shattered. The sobs came in waves, primal and heartbreaking, as she gasped for air like someone drowning in memory. Landon held her like he'd never held anyone before. Not possessively, not protectively, but completely, as if he could absorb some of the agony bleeding through her skin. Her hands gripped his coat like a child clutching a lifeline, and he buried his face in her hair, whispering nothing, because words felt like lies in the face of so much pain. When they returned to his penthouse, she didn't speak for hours. She just sat curled on the floor by the window, staring at the rain, her knees tucked under her chin, like she was trying to fold into herself and disappear. Landon knelt beside her and placed a blanket over her shoulders, not saying a word, just staying close enough so she wouldn't feel alone. Night eventually wrapped around the city like a dark veil, and Mercy's voice broke through the silence, raw and low. She was supposed to escape, not die. I told her to go. I told her to chase the world. Her words fractured into sobs again, and Landon, aching with helplessness, wiped a tear from her cheek with the back of his finger. The gesture so intimate, it silenced even the grief for a breath. She wasn't yours to save, he whispered, but you tried. That matters. Mercy leaned into him slowly, her head resting against his chest, and they stayed like that until the stars vanished behind dawn's pale haze. For the first time in his life, Landon didn't want to fix, conquer, or impress. He only wanted to be present, to hold space for someone else's devastation. His heart ached in ways it never had, not because of desire or ego, but because the girl in his arms wasn't a game. She was a storm he didn't want to survive without. She whispered again as sleep overtook her. Sometimes silence is the loudest pain, and those words carved themselves into his ribs. Landon kissed the top of her head gently and replied, and sometimes it's the only thing that heals. But even as he comforted her, guilt began its cruel ascent in his chest. The truth still slept beneath the surface like a buried landmine. The bet, the deception, the cruel beginning that had led them here. Every kind gesture, every shared breath now felt stained with shadow, because she didn't know that he hadn't found her by chance. He had targeted her, sought her out, all for sport. He wanted to confess, to beg, to bleed at her feet, but fear strangled his honesty. How could he destroy the only safe thing she had left, especially now? The longer he waited, the more the lie grew fangs, sinking deeper into the foundation of what they were building. He stared out the window long after she'd fallen asleep beside him, her face tear-stained, her breathing soft, and he wondered if she'd ever forgive him once the truth came to light, or if loving her meant he had to lose her to give her the freedom she deserved. He had never felt more alive, more human, or more terrified in all his life. The rain whispered against the glass like a prayer, soft and unhurried, as though the sky itself had paused to witness something sacred unfold within the walls of the penthouse that no longer felt like a fortress, but a cathedral of silence and flickering warmth. Mercy stood by the window, wrapped in the shadows of midnight and the soft glow of a single floor lamp. Her eyes steady, luminous, not with seduction, but with something far braver, vulnerability without fear. She turned slowly, her bare feet pressing against the cold marble, her breathing calm yet full of quiet thunder. And when she met Landon's gaze, it wasn't a question. It was an answer she had waited her whole life to give. I'm not scared anymore, she said, her voice the softest storm he'd ever heard. Not of the world, not of pain, not even of love. And as her trembling fingers began to unfasten the buttons of her plain cotton dress, there was no performance, no hesitation, only a gentle releasing of weight she had carried far too long, not shedding clothes to be desired, but shedding armor to be seen. Landon watched, breath stolen, not by the sight of skin, but by the sacredness of the moment. This wasn't a conquest, it was a communion, a holy stillness where nothing impure could exist. Before he could speak, before he could ruin it with a word, he dropped to his knees, not in desperation, but in awe, his hands reaching for hers like they were lifelines, his forehead pressing against her knuckles as though confessing to a higher power he no longer believed in. I don't want your body, he whispered, voice thick with emotion he could no longer hide. I want your forgiveness. Mercy looked down at him, her lip trembling but her eyes clear, and she knelt with him, both of them on the ground now, not broken, but finally equal. She wrapped her arms around him, not to comfort, but to be close, And in that fragile embrace, they didn't burn. They breathed. There was no music but the rain, no candles but the soft flicker of city lights outside, and no sound but their quiet inhale and exhale as the distance between two worlds finally disappeared. They laid together fully clothed on the bed, wrapped not in sheets but in stillness, her head resting above his heartbeat, his hand tracing soft circles on her back with reverence, not desire. They didn't speak of the past or promise the future. They just existed, piece by piece, wound by wound, letting their silences echo and fold into each other. He didn't reach to possess, he held to protect. She didn't offer to please, she offered to simply be. And in that space between pain and healing, they found a version of intimacy the world had forgotten, a connection untouched by lust, forged in truth. No moans, no fireworks, just the deep, soul-stirring sound of two hearts finally learning how to beat in sync, not as strangers, not as sinners, but as survivors, slowly becoming each other's sanctuary. In the weeks that followed Mercy's disappearance, Manhattan felt like a mausoleum. Every flashing light, every rooftop party, every glistening skyline that once fed Landon's ego now mocked him with brutal clarity. And for the first time in his life, he didn't run toward noise to drown the silence. He walked into the quiet, letting it consume him like penance. The penthouse he once ruled over now sat dark and hollow, stripped of opulence, the walls echoing only with the sound of her name. He couldn't breathe without remembering her voice, couldn't sleep without reliving the look in her eyes when trust died. So he disappeared, sold his shares in his father's legacy tech empire, walked away from the boardroom that once trembled at his name. He shut down the exclusive clubs bearing his initials, closed the luxury lines, deleted the media deals, silenced every platform that celebrated a version of him he could no longer stomach. He started a foundation, the Miriam Hope Project, in Mercy's sister's name, funding shelters, addiction recovery clinics, and trauma therapy centers in all 5 boroughs. He didn't make an announcement, no press, no ribbon cutting, just quiet checks and handwritten letters to directors saying, "Use this to save the ones we forgot." He returned every cent he ever made from the night of that cursed gala, every investment, every payout linked to the event, and funneled it anonymously into safe houses for women at risk. But no amount of reparation erased the emptiness. Mercy was gone, and redemption, it seemed, had no audience. Months passed. He let his beard grow, the sparkle in his eyes dulled, his suits traded for plain shirts and worn boots. He learned how to be invisible, how to scrub floors in the shelters he funded, how to sit beside detoxing addicts and hold their hands without judgment. But still, her silence haunted him. Then one gray-skied October afternoon, a retired social worker at a women's clinic told him of a young volunteer teaching literacy in a small Pennsylvania Amish town. A woman with a quiet soul, golden hair always in a braid, and a softness that made even the roughest children listen. Landon's heart thundered with both hope and fear as he drove through endless stretches of open fields, rain starting to drizzle against his windshield, as if the sky remembered them too. When he found her, she was sitting cross-legged on a checkered mat under a wooden gazebo beside the schoolhouse, reading a worn fairy tale book to a half-circle of barefoot children huddled close beneath umbrellas. Mercy's voice was just as he remembered, calm, warm, tender, like a hymn you forget you know until it breaks your heart again. She didn't see him at first. He didn't speak. He just stood there in the rain, soaked to the bone, afraid that even breathing might break the fragile miracle he was witnessing. And then she looked up. Their eyes met. The children looked between them, confused, and Mercy slowly rose, handing the book to a teacher beside her. She walked toward him across the muddy path, each step slow and careful, not with anger, but with gravity. Landon felt the weight of every step like a reckoning. His once pristine white shirt was clinging to his frame, his face older, his soul softer. "You came," she said simply, her voice carrying both wonder and ache. "I didn't know if you ever would." He tried to smile, but it trembled into a whisper. "I never meant to fall in love, but I did, and I never deserved to, but I still do." Mercy's lips parted. tears filling her eyes, and she raised her hand to his cheek, gently brushing her fingers across the rain and the ruin. "You didn't break me, Landon," she said, voice quivering. "You rebuilt me. Not with words, but with every quiet choice you made when I wasn't watching." He exhaled like the weight of the world had finally slipped from his chest. "Then let me spend forever proving I'm worthy of the miracle you are," he whispered. And before her breath could even catch, he reached into the pocket of his soaked jeans and pulled out a tiny velvet box, one he'd carried for months, never daring to hope. He didn't open it immediately. He fell to his knees, not in arrogance, not for effect, but in reverence and surrender, in the truest form of love he'd ever known. "Not as a billionaire," he said, his voice shaking, "not as a man trying to make up for 1,000 sins, but just as me, just Landon. And I'm asking, not because I deserve you, but because I want to spend the rest of my life becoming someone who might." Mercy's tears broke free. She didn't shout, didn't swoon. She simply nodded, lowering herself beside him, their foreheads touching beneath the soft drizzle of the rain. The same kind of rain that once began a cruel dare now bore witness to a sacred vow. The children in the distance clapped quietly, sensing something magical had happened, though they didn't yet understand why. Mercy held Landon's face between her palms and whispered, "This time, we begin in truth." And as the sky wept its soft silver blessing upon them, the past finally surrendered, and love, real love, took its first unshakable breath.